now that we have understood about OAuth 2 and how Facebook supports OAuth 2, let's move on to this exercise where we will configure our Express server application to make use of Facebook as the OAuth 2 provider for our server and at the same time for our client application. In this exercise, we're going to be relying on the passport that we have already configured in our Express application. We will configure a new strategy for authenticating with Facebook using the Passport Facebook token node module. To get started on this exercise, go to https://developers.facebook.com apps. Now this is where you will register a client application, which is basically your server, the Express server, acting as the client application for Facebook. And then we will register a client application there and then get hold of an app ID and an app secret from Facebook. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that you need to have a Facebook account in order to be able to configure this. If you don't have a Facebook account and you do not wish to do this exercise, then there's no harm in not doing this exercise. But of course, for doing this OAuth 2 exercise, you need a Facebook account to configure our OAuth provider on Facebook. So going to this site, developers.facebook.com/apps, you will notice that you will need to log in order to continue if you are not logged in from your browser. Now you can see that I have already configured a few apps here and tested them out. Now to create a new app, click on the Add New App, and then you can provide the name for your app. So I can say Confusion 3, and then we can provide the contact email and then follow the procedure to create your new app here. And once the app is created, you will immediately notice that there is an app ID that has been created for your app. And then for this particular app, so if you go into the dashboard, you will see two pieces of information that you really require in order to proceed forward. One is the app ID. So make sure that you make a copy of the app ID. And the second one is the app secret. So you can type on the show button here, and then you'll get the app secret here. So as you can see, these two are nothing but ASCII strings. So make a copy of this because you need to configure your Express server and also your client application with these two pieces of information. And once you get hold of that, then we can proceed ahead with the rest of the exercise. You need to go to your dashboard of your application, and in the settings, as you can see in the basic settings here, you just add a website platform here and then supply the URL as https://localhost 3443 and save the changes here to your application here. After adding in the website here, go to the advanced settings and then click on this to say native or desktop app here and say yes to that, and then save the changes. And in the basic settings, in the app domains, type in https://localhost 3443 and save the changes. Next, go to the exercise instructions for this exercise, and you would see that there is an index.html file that I have provided in the exercise resources. Download this index.html file and then move it into your public folder. So let's download this index.html file. Next, going to the Confusion server folder, in the public folder, you see that I already have an index.html file. I'm going to replace this with the downloaded index.html file that I just obtained. I have saved this on my desktop, so I'm just going to pull this index.html and then replace the index.html file in the public folder of my Confusion server. Next, going to the editor, let's open the index.html file. And if you open it, you will see that I have already configured some JavaScript code here. This JavaScript code I got hold of from Facebook, where they specify how you can configure a web application using this. So I've just copied this from the Facebook instructions. In particular, you will notice that in this index.html file, there is this app ID field here. You're going to be replacing this app ID field with the client ID that you obtained by registering your app on Facebook. So here I am replacing this client ID with the ID of my app that I have registered on Facebook here. And you need to do that same step with the app that you register on Facebook, with the app ID that you get from Facebook, and then save the changes to index.html. This index.html page that I have here will create a login button on the index.html page, which when clicked will help us to log into Facebook and then obtain an access token from Facebook. Next, going to the Confusion server folder, we will install the Passport Facebook token node module. So at the prompt, type npm install Passport Facebook token and install this node module. And as you can see, I am using the 3.3.0 version in this course. Going back to the editor, open config.js, and in config.js, I'm going to add in a property called Facebook into my config.js file. And inside here, I will configure my client ID and the client secret. Now, the client ID will be exactly what you obtain from Facebook here. And the client secret, as you saw when you registered your application, you get a second string there. So copy that string and then paste it into the client secret here. Now, make sure that this is pasted as a string here. Similarly, pasting in the client secret into my config.js file. So configuring this here will help me to use these two where I need in my code. Next, as we realized, whenever the user logs in and then obtains the access token and passes it on to our Express server, the Express server is going to use that access token and go and fetch the profile information from the Facebook OAuth server. And then once it obtains the profile information, then our Express server will create a new user account into our application and use the Facebook ID as the index into this user account. So to accommodate this, we will go into the user.js file where we have defined our model. So in addition to the first name and the last name, I will also add in a field here called Facebook ID, which is of the type string here. The Facebook ID will store the Facebook ID of the user that has passed in the access token. In the next step, I will show you how to configure this when we configure our Facebook strategy using the Passport Facebook token. When the user passes in the access token, then we're going to be fetching the profile and then setting up an account for that user in our local server here, in our Express server here. We will be initializing the first name and the last name and the Facebook ID. But of course, this particular account will not have a password, or rather the hash and salt associated with this, because if a user needs to log in using this account, then they will have to use their Facebook login path in order to log into our application. Next, we will go to authenticate.js file. So this is where we have been setting up all our different passport authentication strategies. So here, in addition to the JWT strategy and the local strategy that I have configured here, let me create a Facebook token strategy here, and then say require passport Facebook token. And this will give us a new strategy that we can configure in our passport module here. So going down into the code here, right there at the end of this file, I will create Facebook passport as passport use. And so this is where I will specify new Facebook token strategy here. And then we will specify the details of this Facebook token strategy right at this point here. So in this Facebook token strategy, how do we approach this problem? Let me just wrap around the word wrap so that you can see the complete code. So for the Facebook token strategy, we will start out by saying first, the first part of the Facebook token strategy takes the client ID, which we have configured at config.facebook client ID here, and client secret, which also we have configured in our config file here. So we're going to be supplying this as the first parameter to this strategy here. And then the second parameter is where we define the callback function that comes in at this point. So the callback function here gets three values. So it gets access token, refresh token, profile, and a callback called as done here. So these are the four parameters that come into the callback function that we will configure at this point. So let me indent the code in so that it's a bit more clearer to see. And inside this callback function that I configure here, I'm going to first say user find one. So we'll try to see if this particular Facebook user has logged in earlier, and so the account would already be configured with the Facebook ID. Now, where do we obtain the Facebook ID? Notice that we are getting the profile for the user coming in here. So you can see that this profile is coming in as a parameter. This profile will carry a lot of information coming in from Facebook that we can use within our application. The access token, of course, is supplied to the server by the user. So once we try and find at least one user with the Facebook profile ID, so if this user exists, then we have already found that the user has previously logged into our account using the Facebook approach. So in this case, we can proceed forward. Otherwise, we will create a new user. So the callback function here will have two parameters, the error and the user here. And this callback function, as we would see, will inside here, we will check to say if error. So if this causes an error, then of course what we need to do is return done, error, and false. So this done, as you can see, is the callback function that is coming in as the parameter to this function here. So we'll call the done with the error and false. If it is not an error, then we'll say if not error and user not equal to null. So if the user is not null, so that means that we have found a user in the system that has logged in earlier with that particular Facebook ID. So for that user, all that we need to do is return done null, since there is no error here, and then we'll return the user value for this done here. So which means that if the user has already logged in earlier using the Facebook approach, then the user would have already been created, and so that user will be found, and then we just pass back that user. If not, see, the if not part is the more interesting part of this exercise. If the user doesn't exist, then we need to create a new user. Now to create the new user, we will say user new user, and when we create a new user, recall that we need to pass in the username. The username would be obtained from the profile, and the Facebook profile that is returned will have a field called as display name. And so that is the field that I'm going to use to create a new user here. So we will create a new user with the username set equal to the display name. And after the user is created, then we will say user Facebook ID equal to profile ID. So we are going to be saving the Facebook ID of the user. So return in this profile object here, and then put the user's ID, Facebook ID, to the profile ID, so that subsequently, if the same user logs in, this search will be able to find this user in our database. And then we will say user first name is profile name given name. So the profile has this name object on it, which has a given name and a family name associated with this. This is returned from the user's Facebook profile. So, and also the user's last name, we will set it to profile name family name. And then once we have set up all this, we'll say user.save. So we are saving the changes to the user, and then this will return error and the user. So it will return an error if the user could not be created. Otherwise, it will return the created user here. So in this case, we'll say if error, then we will return done error false, because we didn't manage to create the user. Else, the user was successfully created, so we'll return done null user. So no matter what the case is, if the user exists, then you will find that user and return the value. If the user doesn't exist, you're going to be creating a new user based upon the user's Facebook profile that we obtain, and then add in the new user into our server side, into the database. So this is the strategy that we configure for our Passport, the new Facebook token strategy. So this will enable us to find the user. So now that we have configured our application to either create a user or find the user based on the Facebook ID, the last step is, of course, to introduce a new route into the users.js file. So in the users.js file, you recall that we had the sign up route, which allows the user to sign up for a local account with the username and password. And then you have the login, which allows the user to log in using the username and password. But now we're going to be using Facebook for logging in the user. So in this case, we will say router get, and the endpoint will be /Facebook token. So if the user sends a GET request to users/Facebook/token, then we're going to be authenticating the user using the Facebook OAuth 2 based authentication. So here we will say passport authenticate, and we're going to be authenticating using the Facebook token strategy. Recall that we had already configured this in our authenticate.js file. So we'll configure the passport authenticate Facebook token strategy, and then the callback function, which gets res here. So let me toggle the word wrap here. So you can see that this is the router get on this endpoint here. And then in here, I will configure this application. So at this point, we would say if rec user. Now notice that when we call passport authenticate with the Facebook token strategy, this, if it is successful, it would have loaded in the user into the request object. So by the time we come to this point here, after the passport Facebook token, passport authenticate Facebook token middleware is executed, we would have the user already loaded into the request object. So if this is the case, then we'll say we'll create a token. We will create a JSON Web Token here, just like the way we created the JSON Web Token when the user logged in here. So we're going to be copying that here, authenticate get token. So this will get us the JSON Web Token. So essentially, the user is sending their access token to the Express server. The Express server uses the access token to go to Facebook and then fetch the profile of the user. And if the user doesn't exist, it'll create a new user with that Facebook ID. And then after that, then our Express server will generate a JSON Web Token and then return the JSON Web Token to our client. All subsequent accesses from our user will have to include this JSON Web Token that we have just returned by using this approach. So at this point, you no longer need the Facebook access token anymore. You can discard the Facebook access token at this point, because the JSON Web Token is the one that keeps the user's authentication active for whatever duration that this JSON Web Token is active. Now, in addition to this, of course, we also need to do these steps here. So I'm just going to copy that part here, because I'm going to do exactly the same thing in this case also. So we will paste in that code here. So we'll say status code 200, content header type, and then we'll say res JSON, you're successfully logged in, and that's it. So with this approach, as you can see, now using a call to this endpoint, the user application, the client in this case, will pass in the Facebook access token that it has obtained from Facebook, and then our Express server will then use that Facebook access token to verify the user on Facebook. And then if the user is acknowledged by Facebook to be a legitimate user, then our Express server will return a JSON Web Token to our client, and then our client is authenticated and then can proceed forward with carrying out the other operations using the JSON Web Token in the header of all the request messages subsequently, just like we did with the local authentication strategy. That's it. So we have completed all the updates to our application. Let's save the changes. Going to our terminal, let's start up the server here. So we'll say npm start, and the server is up and running. And I noticed that I had typed in PASSS port, and so this caused an error here. So notice that how easy it is to make errors. So let me go and correct that and then come back and restart my server. So when you encounter errors like this, don't panic. Look around to see where the problem is, and very often it will be a simple problem like this that will cause errors for you. Again, going back to the users.js, and you see that in the authenticate.js file, I have configured this saying PASSS port. So in the authenticate.js file, let me fix that to passport and then save the changes and then restart my server. Now restarting my server. So my server is now up and running. At this point, go to a browser, and in the browser type https localhost 3443. If you happen to have this page cached here, you may wish to remove the cache or just type localhost :3443/index.html, and then you will immediately notice that in this index.html you will see this button called login button. So we're going to click on this login button to log into Facebook. Let's log in, and then you will come up with this message here, which if you have already logged into Facebook earlier, which will ask for the permission to continue as the user. If not, then it'll ask you to log into Facebook and then allow you to continue. Since I had just logged into Facebook a little bit earlier, so I can just click on continue. Now, open the developer's JavaScript console at the bottom here, and in the JavaScript console, you see a bunch of messages printed in here. And then in particular, open this object that you will see in the JavaScript console. And inside this object, you will see this auth response here. And in there, you will see an access token present there. Now, this is a reply that is obtained from Facebook OAuth 2 authentication server by our application here. And I'm going to simply copy this because this is the access token that Facebook has supplied to us. Now, I need to give this access token to my Express server in order for it to go and verify my profile and then allow me to log into the application. So I am doing this in a kludged way here simply because I wanted to show you how the access token comes in here. We copy the access token. Then I'm going to take this and use Postman to send this access token to my Express server. Now, when you design a web app like Angular or the Ionic app or the NativeScript app, you don't need to do all these steps. Now, basically, when the access token is returned to your web app, the Angular app or the Ionic app or the NativeScript app, you will simply capture this access token in there, and then you will pass this access token on to the Express server using the XML HTTP request to obtain the information. But since I wanted to manually illustrate the steps, so I set up this index.html with the simple JavaScript code that Facebook provides for me, and so that I will be able to retrieve this authorization token that we obtained from Facebook. So let me copy this authorization token. Now we will go to Postman and then try and see how we can obtain the JSON Web Token from our Express server. Now going to Postman, from Postman, let me now do a GET request to localhost :3443 user's Facebook token. And when I send this request to that point, the other configuration that I need to do here is that I need to pass in this access token that I have just obtained. Now, to pass in the access token, in the header, I can pass it in as an authorization header by typing authorization, but note that the value should be typed as bearer with a capital B in this case, and then paste the access token that we obtained from Facebook in here. Note the capital B here. And then you can pass in this to our server. And then upon reply from our server, you would see that you would have obtained the JSON Web Token from our server side. So this is one way that you obtain the JSON Web Token, by exchanging your access token from Facebook that you have just obtained with your Express server, and your Express server in turn will go and verify your profile and obtain your profile information from Facebook, and then create an account specifically for you, and then return you the JSON Web Token if everything is successful. Another way of passing in this information is in the header you type access underscore token as the key, and in the value you just type in the access token like this here, and then you can send the request, and the same thing, it'll again return the JSON Web Token for you, and then you capture the JSON Web Token and then carry on with the rest of the accesses to your Express server using this JSON Web Token. A third approach is to include this into your URL itself as a query parameter. The third approach is to say token question mark access underscore token is equal to, and then paste the JSON Web Token into the query parameter. Don't use the quotes here, just the JSON Web Token itself, and then send the request to your server, and then even then your server will return the corresponding JSON Web Token. So you see three different ways that you can pass in your Facebook access token to your server and then obtain the JSON Web Token from your server. And after this, the rest of the steps proceed just like before. Now, to convince you that actually a new account has been created with the Facebook profile for this particular user, let's go to the terminal. In the terminal, in a new terminal window, I will start the Mongo REPL here. So in the Mongo REPL, let me say use confusion, and then I'll say db users find pretty, and then print out all the users that are registered in my system. You notice that the 3 users that we had configured in the previous exercises are all there. Notice in addition a 4th user that has just been added in. And note that for this particular user, we don't have the hash and salt set, but instead the Facebook ID of that user is set up, and the username is set up to be that value, and the first name is set up there, and also the last name should have been set up here, but I think there is a small error in my code, so I will go and check the last name part of it there. Going to authenticate.js, let me see if I made a mistake here. There we go. I typed in FAMMILY name. So you see, even I am not above making mistakes. So this should be family name here. User last name profile.name.family name here, not family name here. So let me save the changes, and now the code should work correctly. Again, going back to the terminal, you now see that a new user has been created with the Facebook profile here. Now, any subsequent time I try to authenticate myself using Facebook is the same process. I obtain the access token from Facebook and then pass in the access token to my Express server. My Express server will then go to Facebook, fetch the profile, and then check to see if the user already exists. And in the subsequent login that I do using Facebook, I would find that this particular user is already existing in the system. So it'll simply proceed forward and the user will be authenticated, and then the Express server will issue a JSON Web Token to the client, and we can proceed forward from that point onwards, just like before. So you see, setting up OAuth 2 based authentication using a OAuth 2 service provider like Facebook is not that difficult, provided we get hold of the appropriate Passport Facebook authentication strategy based module like Passport Facebook token, which already takes care of much of the work on our behalf and then enables us to set up our Express server to handle third-party authentication based on OAuth 2 from Facebook. With this, we complete this exercise. In this exercise, we have learned how to do OAuth 2 authentication using Facebook as the OAuth 2 authentication provider. This is a good time for you to save the changes that you have made to your Git repository with the message Passport Facebook.